All right, folks. So, you think about what we've done in JavaScript so far. It's actually been quite a lot. We've done a lot of the foundation, if you will, with JavaScript, just getting JavaScript set up, getting it to run, doing some arithmetic, solving some problems, getting some output, input, math, output. There's a lot of what we know, and then we learned how to troubleshoot, right? And when you think about, what we've really changed on a web page, we've learned how to change the inner HTML of something, and we've learned how to change a value on a text box. So those are really the two things that we've learned how to do. We've learned how to replace the inner HTML, the text, if you will, on a paragraph. And we've learned how to replace a value in a text box. Okay, but we haven't worked. What if you want to use JavaScript to swap out an image? You could do image swaps. What if you want to use JavaScript to introduce a new paragraph or a new list? You hover over an image and all of a sudden a little description box pops up, right? So you add new HTML to the page. What if you want to use JavaScript to change colors using CSS? What it boils down to is JavaScript's a lot more powerful than how we've been using it so far. JavaScript can do a lot more stuff, completely manipulate the HTML, completely manipulate the CSS, right? To change, add, remove things. And so we really haven't learned all these different things really that JavaScript can do as far as changing, adding, removing your HTML and your CSS. We've really just used the inner HTML property and the value property. And we've selected things and we've done some math and we've read, okay. So JavaScript is quite a bit more powerful than how we've been using it, right? Create new HTML elements, right? You can add classes. So I'm thinking of a paragraph, right? And I've got a CSS class that makes a paragraph a certain font and a certain font size and color, right? And you can add that class to your HTML element and change its colors and change its fonts and all this kind of stuff. So you can add classes, remove classes, all these kinds of things. So you can do a lot more. And in order to do a lot more, we get familiar with this concept of it's like a synonym for JavaScript. They refer to it as the DOM, the Document Object Model. And I hope to kind of simplify what is the DOM. Because you hear this all the time and you really need to understand it in the world of JavaScript. What is the DOM? It's really it's not that complex of, I will tell you personally, for a long time I'm like, the DOM, I don't get it. I really don't get it. For a long time it took me to understand, but it's really not that hard of a concept to grasp. So hopefully I can help you with that. So, in a nutshell, that's what we're going to be learning how to do. That's why it's important. Yeah. Why is this chapter important? I always like to talk about why is this important. This chapter is important because we're going to begin to understand more of what JavaScript can do. And right now, we haven't been using it a whole lot by understanding the DOM. Well, part of the DOM, we get these things called these interfaces. These interfaces allow these properties, all the different ways to work with your HTML. And so all these properties, parent node, child node, first child, last child, these are all ways in JavaScript to work with your HTML. Right? Use JavaScript to target and modify your HTML. You've already used these methods, query selector and query selector all. So we got these new properties we're going to be using. You've been using these methods, We've got some other methods like has attributes, get attribute, set attribute, remove attribute. What is that talking about? Attributes. HTML attributes. So what's an HTML attribute? Well, for example, one attribute is the source attribute of an anchor tag. The href attribute of an anchor tag. Source is image. Right? Use JavaScript to set the attribute to a certain value. Right? So you click on a link, you could use JavaScript to tell the link where to go. You could set an attribute. You can remove an attribute, so on and so forth. You know, like a Boolean attribute, right? Disabled. Right? So you got an input field that's disabled, you could remove that. I'm going to talk about this DOM HTML specification versus the DOM core specification. Right? So there's these two specifications, and one's a little bit easier than the other, and you'll see that as we go through. We'll use a class list property. Let's see. We already know what a reset and a submit button do. We'll work a little bit more with form controls in JavaScript, like a text box control, a text area, select radio. We'll focus on a few more of these events, so you're familiar with these events: the submit event on a form, the reset on a form, the focus on a control, blur, select, how those work. And then some methods to add elements to the DOM. So in other words, we can add new paragraphs using append child, this kind of stuff. So a lot of objectives, okay? Let's take a look at this HTML now that we're through our objectives. Pretty basic HTML, I think you would all agree. Pretty standard HTML5 doc type. We've got our parent HTML tag. We've got the head with the title in it. We've got the body. The body has an H1 and a form. That form has a label. That label is associated with the ID of email address. So this is label for the email address, the ID of the email address. So it's a single input and a label. Keep in mind, this is really important for accessibility purposes. This label for email address, this is very important for screen readers to be able to associate this piece of text with the text box, basically telling people who are blind what's the purpose of this text box. Right? So this is a really important way to code your labels. But really nothing new here. And then there's a little span here that will kind of give you a little star if there's an error message, right? If you forgot to fill it out, you know, you basically you hide this span unless there's an error, and then you display the span. So this is the DOM for a website. Okay, what is DOM? Document Object Model. Let's break down these words. To understand the DOM, let's understand these words. What in JavaScript does the document represent? The HTML. So this is a model. What's a model? A model is a picture. A model is a picture. This is a picture of objects that represent your HTML document. This is a picture of objects, JavaScript objects that represent your HTML document. Now, this model, this picture, is how the JavaScript engine understands your HTML document. Everyone remembers that in our browser, i.e. Chrome, Chrome has something called the JavaScript engine. Okay? This is the tool built into all browsers that runs your JavaScript. There was a rendering engine that draws the page, that draws your HTML and your CSS, and there's a separate JavaScript engine. Okay? So the DOM is simply a picture, a model that represents how the JavaScript engine understands and can work with your HTML. That's all it is. Okay? So the JavaScript engine in your browser loads your HTML into its memory, right? And what that looks like is this DOM, right? The JavaScript engine understands the document in this way. So for the JavaScript to manipulate the HTML, it has to manipulate the DOM. Basically, it has to manipulate this picture, if you will. By manipulating the DOM, you're going to manipulate your HTML. Right? So again, I'm going to try and I'd like to explain it like I'm 5, if I can. That's what I'm trying to do here. The DOM is how your browser understands the HTML. That's what it is. The DOM is how your browser understands and can work with the HTML. So the JavaScript engine would look at the HTML that was provided on slide 4, and it would view it like this picture. By manipulating this picture, you are manipulating the DOM, therefore manipulating your HTML or your CSS. Well, really, we'll see. We'll see. It's really just the HTML, right? By modifying what classes are on things, you can apply CSS classes and apply IDs. I'm trying out this new Rankin mask for my video viewers online. It's not a good mask because it goes below the nose. This is not wearing a mask properly. We all know this. We've been a year and a half to a pandemic. I'm trying to keep it above my nose. I apologize. I should stop wearing this mask because it's just not. It doesn't fit my face. Moving on. So all of these little, what are called nodes on this picture, there are types of nodes. There's a node that represents the document. There's a node that can represent an element. There's a node that can represent an attribute, which we don't really see any attribute nodes. So if I'm looking at this picture, I see element nodes. One example of an element node would be body or HTML or H1. These are element nodes. I also see nodes that represent text, right? So they're in green. So I don't really see, what you don't really see in this picture are either attribute nodes. I don't think there's any attribute nodes. Like the ID attribute. Like you don't really see that here. You don't see text nodes. Okay. But these are nodes. These are things that can be identified as parent and children. So it's really interesting to me when I was learning this for the first time that a text node inside of a span is a child node. So to manipulate a piece of text inside of a span, you would think you would just target the span itself and do something like enter HTML, which you can if you want to replace it, right? But if you want to read what's in that span, right, you might have to go into its child node, which is a text node, and then read that text node, Right? So that's just kind of something that I'm foreshadowing because that's kind of weird. That's one of the weirder things in this chapter to me, that these text nodes are in fact children of their parents. So H1s, if you want to read the value of a heading in your JavaScript, you might have to go into its child node and manipulate it that way. So that's an interesting thing. That always throws people off a little bit, myself included, from time to time. Yep.
Like when it comes to the header tags, H2, H3, and so on, right? Would those be kind of considered like a child of H1 just because they're more of like subheadings?
So what we're looking at here, good question. So like, are you saying like H2 would be a child of H1?
Yes.
Okay. No. What we're looking at here in this picture is this structure right here in a tree form. So notice the children of body. There's going to be an H1 child and a form child. So direct children of body are H1 and form. So if I look under body, I see H1 and form. So these are the two children of body. So if I had, for example, an H2 here, then H1, form, and my H2, they would all be considered siblings. Okay? So it just depends on the nesting in the HTML that creates this tree-like structure. They call it like an upside-down tree, because normally a tree starts skinny at the top and goes wide up at the top, right? Or starts skinny at the bottom and wide at the top. This starts skinny at the top and goes wider as you go down. So it's an upside-down tree structure.
It's a Christmas tree. Pine tree.
Yeah, pine tree. We'll call it pine tree. Good. I agree. Right? So these are the nodes that kind of come together to create a DOM tree. The DOM tree is our Christmas tree. There we go. Okay. So all of these nodes have these properties. So if you select, for example, if you select an H1, and H1 is an element node, and you have these properties that let you work with that H1. One of which would be parent node. So some of these, right now we're selecting everything directly using their IDs, right? And we've got query selector, so we've got a lot of flexibility in query selector, how to select the right elements. Right? We haven't really been struggling to select things in our JavaScript. But some of these properties are just that parent node would kind of target the parent of H1. The parent of H1 would be body. So if I targeted my H1, and because it's a node, I can use these properties of it. I got the node interface. I could look at its parent node. I could look at all of its child nodes, right? Nodes plural, meaning it's probably selecting multiple things. When you select multiple things, keep in mind you're probably working with an array, right? So child nodes, first child, last child, next element, sibling. So the H1's next element, sibling, well, the sibling of the H1 would be form, right? So a lot of these properties right here are just kind of helping us select the elements around that tag. Okay? Node value. Node value is going to be what we use to actually read what's in the node. So let's actually do some coding of this stuff, and I want to show you here. Node value versus text content. All right. I think we'll just do a little index.htm, and I'll show you just kind of the result of these things. Let me just That works. Okay. I need to turn this little code thing off. It's more annoying than anything else. Let's do a selector. Let's select our H1. Wait a minute, we don't even have an H1. Yeah, we do have an H1. Okay, so here's our properties. And let's just do node value. So this is going to load top to bottom. So let's see what's in our H1's node value. It's coming back null. Typo, typo. H1, get on with ID, simple enough, node value of null. Let's do, because let's do, okay, first child text content. Okay. That's what I would expect. So let's talk about this line of code which is working versus the line of code that I wrote that wasn't working, and I'll address that in a minute. We're selecting our H1. I had to append the first child property. Remember that the text value is a child node. And then I read the text content. So we could put that into a variable. We could then substring that out, right? You know, alert, data, substring. Zero, comma, 2, right? Start manipulating the data, right? We start at character 0 and we go for 2 characters, right? So start working with the data. So if you want to replace, you know, this text, please join our email list with document get element by ID. This is annoying. I need to turn that off. So this is kind of a silly example, but it shows something. It shows that we read something that's on the screen, we manipulated it, and then we update what they see on the screen.
Yeah, that's echoed on the selector.
Thank you. Right? That can be useful. That could be useful. Now, the other property that was not working for me was node value. Let's take a look at node value. I'm going to alert the node value of its first child. Oh, I know what's going on. It's kind of like an inner HTML thing. I'm assuming the value typically is represented in a text box. So node value is going to be using. I'm not going to have a value of a heading. It's going to this is going to be used for a text box. So I can still, well, node value worked of the child. Regardless, that's kind of using these right here, these top ones. They're kind of used to what you could say traverse the DOM, go up and down the DOM, right? Move around in relation to its selector. So, and then these are used to actually pull information out. Let's see. So here, an HTML span with 3 children. That gets the entire span object. Okay, so that's really nothing new. This allows us to select the span. I want to show you what that does real quick. Instead of take that out of quotes. So that loads the entire object into memory, right? And if we remember our troubleshooting tools, you would be able to kind of break down that object and look at all of its different properties, of which node value and let me close the syllabus, close inside ranking. So this selects the element object. Keep in mind, once you select the object, you still have to work with that object properties to work with its data and everything inside of it. So this example is going to be very similar to what I did. How to get the text out of a span element with the node value. So here, notice we're creating a variable. We target the span, which was the variable that we created here. So we selected an element, went to its first child, node value. So what is that? Spans, first child. So what's the first child to span? The first child to span is this B tag. What's the first child of the B tag? That is the welcome. That is the text element, right? And then node value. So B element is going to hold the word welcome. U element, this would be how to select the U, right? So the U is the span's first child, first sibling. So it's a sibling of the B tag. So that's why here, let's traverse this. Spans, child, first sibling, child, node value. Again, these things here just traverse the DOM, go up and down and sideways from whatever selector that we've made. Now here we have a last child property. Here span's last child is the I. The last child property is the I, and then you could guess last child, first child, node value. First child targeting the text. And then that, logs that. So it's kind of walking through which is interesting. So text content, I was not doing a good job of differentiating the difference between text content and node value, but the slideshow does just that. If you look at the text content, span text content, what is span? Span is the parent. Text content is all of the text that's in there. So if you want to display the words welcome back, you could do this more complex node value, traversing each individual element and then getting the node value out of each one. Or here we just target the parent and then grab all of the text content. So really what you do, let's see if I can demo this. There's my span. And let me just alert. So my selector, const span equals document query selector span, so that should work. Alert span dot text content. There you go. Welcome back. So that's actually, node value is kind of like a single element node, which you want to go into the child of the text and all that. Whereas the text content property is a little bit more powerful, so I like that. I think that's newer in this textbook. So keep in mind that what goes on the left of the equal sign is what's changing. So here we're changing the text content of the first child, which was the B tag, to be the word hurry. So what was saying welcome back, we're changing the word welcome, which was the B. We're changing the first child's text content to be the word hurry. So it'll say hurry back instead of welcome back. If you change the text content of the span, it replaces all the child elements within the text node, right? So what was saying welcome back, now it just says hi. This changes all of the text, replaces all the child elements. With a text node. So if you think about that, let's do that. Let's just do span dot text content equals hi. So what was saying welcome back in bold and underline and italicized, now it just says hi. There's no bold, there's no italicized, there's no underline. Right? So if you inspect, it's literally a span with the value of hi. Okay, we're at kind of like a 40-ish minute, or a little bit, 35 minutes. At a good point for a break, right? Because we've covered these different properties of nodes, right? Really, they're not that complex. in the sense that some of them are used to kind of traverse the DOM up and down and sideways. And then these are actually just used to work with the data itself, right? So we covered this. You might look at this, by the way, you might look at this and go, man, that looks terrible. There should be an easier way. And there is. There is an easier way. Yes?
Yeah, it seems unnecessarily complex.
It seems unnecessarily complex. I agree.
You're probably going to tie this into some events where stuff would change.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we're going to, at the end of this, we're going to make some useful applications that use this kind of stuff. But this is called the, these are properties of the node interface. And the node interface is part of this HTML specification. But they made another way of writing this called the core specification that simplifies that. So, does it seem unnecessarily complex? Yeah, in kind of ways it is. So they made easier ways, but just being introduced to this stuff. So let's go ahead and take a short break. Let's take 10 minutes. So taking what we now know a little bit more about why some of the early, the first thing I did in this lecture, it kind of returned null, and it was like, well, why is it doing that? But we could probably piece it together now. Node value was really used to get a piece of text from a text element, right? So when I selected the heading node value, it didn't really work because it doesn't have a piece of text in itself. You got to go into the child element, and I demonstrated that, right? Kind of here, that I had to go into the first child and get its node value. So selecting the element itself and going to node value, this is actually a very common mistake that I see. Of course, I demonstrated that mistake because you think, oh, I just want to get the value out of the H1, and that's how you're going to do that. And in fact, you got to go into the text element that's its child. Okay, so we now understand that a little bit better, why that was in fact returning null as it was doing. So understanding that. We've been working with query selector and query selector all. Now keep in mind, query selector, this was the selector that takes in a CSS selector. So all of our CSS selectors that we learn, we can use query selector. Query selector all, though, will select multiple elements on a page. And so you might have a bunch of anchor tags and select them all with query selector all, or you might have a bunch of paragraph tags, so on and so forth. Once you have an element selected, like an anchor tag or like a list or a paragraph, remember you're selecting an entire element, you have some methods that can be used to modify that element, set attribute, remove attribute, or read has attribute versus get attribute. Has attribute is going to be like a Boolean, true or false. Yes, this anchor tag has the attribute for a source, true or false. Versus get attribute would be more of a reading function. Let's read the attribute value as opposed to just determining whether you have it. Okay, so we'll use these methods. Again, these methods belong to what's called the element interface. Basically, anything that's an element will have these methods. All right, really nothing new here on slide 12, right? We're using the query selector all to select all of our anchor tags and put it inside of an array. That array is called links. So that's just demonstrating query selector all. Moving on to our next example, we have a simple list. Inside of that list, we have two list items, and those items are images, lions and tigers. So here we're using the query selector to select our UL tag, and then another query selector all to select two LIs and put them inside of an array. So this line is an array, items is an array, list is a single element representing the UL list. So list versus items, two variables that we have. Now that we have an element, that element is a list, we could write a little bit of code using, hey, if the list has an attribute called class. It doesn't at this point. This list does not. So in that example, that should return false. But let's say it does have a class. Then let's read the attribute of class and store that in a variable. Why does that matter? Well, what if you want to change the styling of the list? Right? You might be able to set the attribute. So this, again, these are really just reading functions. We're just determining, does the list have an attribute? And if it does have an attribute, what's the value of that attribute? This is actually kind of useful because you don't want to get an attribute if it doesn't have an attribute. Right? If you try and get an attribute that it doesn't have, that could be a problem. That would probably break. Okay, so that's why you typically put this in an if statement first to see, hey, does it have this class attribute? If it does, go ahead and read it. Here, they're setting an attribute. So here, this list, again, the list is a UL. Let's set an attribute to a class of open. So in the CSS, there might be a class called open. And keep in mind, on our lists, on our ULs, a lot of times you have your list style image, right? So you could have a class of open that sets the list style image to be, certain icons, right? So this would be how you would modify a class, right? Or in other words, add a class of open. By the way, this would overwrite it if there was something there. This would overwrite whatever classes it already had. And this would be how to remove it. So again, kind of looking at, going back here, these are more read functions. These are more modifying functions. What we're getting down into is the nitty-gritty, how to do these small things. These are very small things, right? But what you can wind up doing is really quite powerful, right? Completely manipulating the HTML and or the CSS. Yeah.
So these new functions, I guess, would be used for when you have like a older site running HTML and you're trying to update the code and probably modify it for.
Well, so what are some examples of like actually using these? We're going to get into some code examples. Here's one, right? Now you guys used Bootstrap. Bootstrap had a built-in accordion, right? There were tabs and there were all these things. What you might not have realized is there was a lot of JavaScript going on behind the scenes, right? So Bootstrap uses JavaScript. Right? And what we're learning now is how to write that JavaScript to make a Bootstrap accordion, right? So instead of using Bootstrap to make an accordion, like maybe understanding, well, here's an example of an application that you click the minus sign and it hides some text and it changes this minus sign to a plus sign, right? So showing and hiding content using some of these methods like set attribute of class to be open. The class of open is going to set the image to a minus sign because that's an open expanded on the accordion, if you will. Right? So what we're really getting down into is how to make pages dynamic. without using Bootstrap? Well, because Bootstrap uses this stuff. So again, all of these, what are called interfaces, they're all part of the DOM HTML specification. They came out with something newer called the core specification. I said it's going to kind of simplify things for us, which is where the next slide was going. The core specification, right? So that's the URL for the DOM specification. The DOM HTML specification, so the HTML specification is easier than the core specification. Let me clarify that. The core specification is what we were just going through with all of these elements and interfaces. So the node interface, the element interface that we go through here, the element interface, the document interface, all these methods and properties are simplified using the HTML specification. So really it boils down to there's two ways of writing some of this code. Some of this code can be written in two ways. The easier way being the HTML specification, which is what we're getting into here. You can kind of read about it on the W3 website. So more directly with this HTML specification, if it's an HTML attribute, like the ID attribute, there's a built-in JavaScript property. So like the ID attribute, there's an element, elements have attributes on the HTML side, have JavaScript properties. And so you're very familiar with the href attribute that belongs to an anchor tag. So there's an href property that's part of this core specification. So remember how I said query selector leverages your knowledge of CSS selectors, and it just kind of makes it easier for us. This HTML specification leverages our knowledge of HTML and all of its attributes, and it helps us write JavaScript in a more condensed syntax. So images have source attributes, so here's the source property. Images also have alt attributes, so here's the alt property. So you want to change an image source, it's as simple as targeting the image and then using the source property. Right? You don't have to go to child node and node value and all this kind of stuff. First element sibling and all that jazz. They make it a lot easier. Now some of the properties, you'll notice the source property. It's the source attribute in HTML. It's the source property in JavaScript. Some of these though, like particularly class name. Class is the keyword in JavaScript. So they couldn't use the class property because it's already got class has a purpose. So they had to use class name instead. So there is a property called class name that represents the class attribute. So let's see a little bit how to use this. So here's 3 lines of code to update an image, right? So here's a task. The task is, when you click the image, I want you to change the source attribute. Okay, so how you might do that, when you click the image, target the image with your selector. That's what the $sign function does, right? So select the image. So we now have an element selected. And then do image element set attribute. You're setting the source attribute to be a value of lion. So this is using the core specification. Remember, that's a little bit harder to do. This is using the DOM specification. Literally, image element dot source equals lion. Right? So two ways of doing the same thing. This line does the same thing as this line. Certainly, this HTML specification is a little bit more condensed and easier to write. And here's a couple of examples of using the newer HTML specification. So here, we're selecting all of our anchor tags, putting it inside of an array called links. We're then targeting the first link on the page and then reading the ID of that link and storing that in a variable. So again, the ID attribute in HTML has an ID property in JavaScript. So that makes it easy to read the ID attribute. Reading the href of a link. Once we have so here we're targeting something with the ID of first link and reading its href value and putting it inside of a variable. Here we're targeting a div and setting the class of that div to have value of open and plus. So we're adding two classes to a div. Maybe I just need to write some code here at this point. Do a little bit of code writing, right? So let's just throw in a div. Try and do a simple form with a button. Put a paragraph with some lorem ipsum. And we'll have a little style with a class of blue text. Okay, color blue. And so obviously we don't have the class of blue text. Okay, so we got this annoying tool that keeps getting in my way. Document, get element by ID, button submit, dot, add event listener, click. Okay. F12, console. Okay, button type of button. Did you see my mistake? Button type of button. It was doing a submit. I could tell it was doing a submit because the page was refreshing. There we go. Okay, so we got a button event handler, right? You click the button, it goes green. So instead of, it logs the word clicking. Inside of here, I'm going to target my paragraph. Call it data. Document, get element by ID, data, dot, class name equals blue text. All right, so all I'm doing, very simple event handler. When the user does something, change the page. All right. Using something that we learned today, right? Can everyone look at this and tell what's going on? Pretty simple as far as not a ton of JavaScript, but we're using the class name. Again, this is using the HTML core specification. Basically, most of the time, you would just be able to say class. But class is a reserved word in JavaScript, so they didn't use class name for the property. They didn't use class for the property, they used class name for the property. So we added the class of blue text. In fact, when you inspect it now, you could see there's a class of blue text on the HTML. So again, what are these properties? There's the ID. You could give something or read an ID, set an ID, set a title attribute or get a title attribute, because properties can be used to modify and read. Right? You can add a class or read a class. The name of the tag, you can get the tag name. You can set the HTML href attribute. So let's have an anchor tag. So this anchor tag goes to Google. Okay. Unless you click the button, because then once you click the button, we're going to target document dot query selector, select the A, set the href value to be MySpace. So here, the text goes blue. Now it directs you to MySpace. Changing the value of attributes is actually quite simple. Using this, I think unfortunately what happens is I kind of stumble my way through that other specification a little bit, because that's the more complicated one that doesn't get used as much. This one you can see is a lot more useful. And you take all your HTML attributes that you're familiar with from learning HTML, you apply them as JavaScript properties, and it makes writing JavaScript easier.
So
Yeah.
does the other one have any advantage over the HTML specification?
Good question. So does the other one have any advantages? And I will say that there are some parts that you can't get away with. For example, there is no replacement for query selector. Now, this is part of that other specification. Query selector all. There's really no replacement for that. You're still using parts of it, in other words. So they can mix and match, right? You use pieces of each. So I still used, there's the core specification and the HTML specification. So you still use, this is still part of the core specification.
So then you can use them like in tandem.
You can use them together, yeah. So is there an advantage? Well, no, if you know the newer standard, use the newer standard probably. Let's so we can change the class attribute, we can change an anchor tag. What was it? Pixels, right? And we get some fun image here. And so here's this image source. My goodness. Trying to just copy this image source. Give me a second. Copy this image source from Pexels. So here's our image. Okay. I'm going to add an event listener. Now there's a mouse in. So here's JavaScript Events. And so reminder of the kinds of events. Mouse over, mouse out. So I want to use mouse over. Mouse over is what I'm looking for. So mouse over, I believe that's going to be a capital O, comma, parentheses, arrow, curly, close that curly, put the semicolon here. So we got the click event and we got a mouse over event. And let's just do a console log to make sure mouse over is firing. So you put the mouse over that image and we should get, okay, cannot read properties of null add event listener, so it's not liking the ID of roll me maybe.
Because you have a constable and it's get element.
Oh, get element by ID is just roll me. Thank you. Add event listener, so let's save that. Let's look at that again. So now we're rolling it. Let's hit the console. So maybe it's lowercase, mouse over. There we go. Okay. So now you see you can mouse over the image and you get that console defier. Okay, so instead of just doing a console log, just change the image source to be another image. So let's go to another image on Pexels. Doesn't really matter. Inspect that image. Grab the source. Copy that source. Paste that source. All right. So when we hover the image, you're going to get a rollover. Bada boom. All right.
It doesn't go back though.
You could get it to go back.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure.
Yeah. You could get it to go back.
Okay.
So you would say if the image source is this, change it to that, else change it to this. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's a simple if else. If the image source is one thing, change it to the other. Otherwise, change it to the first. So with an if else, you could get it to roll over and roll out. All right? So it's kind of like it kind of feels lame because what are we really doing? This is kind of lame. Okay, we're changing colors, we're changing image sources, but this is the foundation of like JavaScript. What have we just done? We've used JavaScript to change the CSS on an element. We've used JavaScript to change the HTML attributes of an element, right? You could change, if you can add classes, you could change anything about your HTML. If you can change an attribute, you can change anything about that element, right? So lots of creative minds can go nuts with this stuff. You know, what's possible here? You know, just with this stuff, you know, you can make games, you can, you know, add content to the screen. You know, you gotta have kind of a creative mind, because I'm not that creative, so I'm just doing lame stuff like changing colors. But you're starting to see what this stuff can do.
You make games with it though and all that. Like I can understand the color part. It just kind of looks like the same thing with CSS and HTML.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, I've had students changing images. You know, you're thinking solitaire, right? I'm just thinking of images on a screen. You got cards. You click the deal button, and the cards show up. You know, certain images show up. You know, you click this image. You know, click that image. You're changing image sources. You're moving cards around. So I've had students make solitaire. I've had students make hangman. I've had students make, you know, these kinds of games that, again, I think a little bit more we need to keep learning. We're not quite there. You know, I've had students make text-based like RPGs, you know, that, yeah. How to disable and enable an element. So let's say when you roll the image, you roll over the image, you mouse over the image, and it disables. So there's our button down there, and then as soon as I roll it, it's grayed out now. So the disabled to true. So we show that. Tag name is just like, okay, what kind of tag is this? Like, so we've selected an anchor tag. You know, this just tells you that the tag name is, in fact, an A tag. Many times you'll have multiple classes on an element, so there's a class list property of an element. So you could read that this element has, you know, 3 classes on it. Let's alert. So when we roll over something, let's give our button some classes, right? So class of BTN, BTN large, BTN success, button primary. Doesn't really matter what they are. These are the classes on our button, and as soon as we roll over, we'll console.log document get element by ID. This is our button submit dot class list. How is that useful? Again, if you can read the class list and you know what classes are applied to an element, then you can modify those classes. So let's see, by hovering this, we should be able to in the console see the 3 class lists. Now, they're in an array, right? They're in an array: button, button large, and button primary. The element 0 is button, the element sub 1 is button large, button primary. And then you could see that the class list values and the length. So the length would be 3 in that example, and then the values would be what's in them. So I'm curious if I do, I don't know if I have to do class list sub 0 dot value. Let's see. There it goes. Now it just prints out the values of our class list instead of the array. Before I was selecting the array, now I'm getting the values out of the class list. I'm printing those directly into the console. This is an interesting one. I like toggle. Let's see an example of toggle. I believe they have that. So here is our HTML has a class of first. So an H2 with a class of first. So here we select the H2. So this is a variable that represents our H2. So this heading 2 represents our H2. Using the class list, we can add a new class called blue. Why that's useful is because if you just do .class name, you're replacing everything, right? So this is how to add a new class that it's not overriding what's currently there. So the heading 2 class list add of blue. If you want to remove something and replace it, so obviously remove the blue and add red. And then toggle is very useful. Toggle, here's just removing. Here, we'll just look for a class. If it's there, it'll remove it. If it's not there, it'll add it. Right? So let's kind of apply this. Here's class name. So we do .class list .toggle blue text. So we're targeting the paragraph, getting the class list, and toggling blue text. So it should go every time you click the button's disabled, so let's not do that anymore. We don't want to disable our button. Click it. Broke it. I broke it. Class list toggle. Oh. Now toggle is a method. My mistake here, I was treating toggle like a property. Toggle is a method. So it needs to be sent like that. Let's refresh. Okay. Click the button, blue text. Click the button, removes the blue text. Blue text. Toggle is very useful because toggles adds and removes. And a lot of times that's what you do. You know, you mouse over something, you do one thing, you mouse out, you do something else. Right? So you mouse over, mouse out, toggle will be our if else. If you change the background image. You know, toggle class and you apply the class, the class applies the background image. Here you see if the class list contains blue. So these are all very useful And what these are, you can see this is properties of an object called DOM token list. So all of these contains, add, remove, replace, toggle are part of this DOM token list, which a class list is a DOM token list. It's basically a list of classes. Okay, and then we kind of look here at some HTML, and they, you know, basically what you're doing in this example again is you're just making a not a carousel, an accordion, right, with HTML and JavaScript. Let's see. So that's the end of the FAQs is here on line 30. And then they get into forms. Kind of looking through for some new stuff with forms. Just trying to highlight the stuff that's new in this chapter. So we're reading out of a text box, we're reading out of a text area using the value property, nothing new there. Here we're using the value property of a select element. And so we really haven't used the value property on anything other than a text box, but as you can see here, it can be used on text area and text areas and selects. These are select lists, right? So inside of a select tag, you've got options. And then you could say, hey, you know, based on the value of the dropdown, you can do an if else, and depending on what they selected, you can have your JavaScript respond accordingly. If you select a radio button or a checkbox, keep in mind those are both input tags. Input type of radio and input type of check. You've got two values there. One is the value of that radio button, and one is the checked property. So here's a radio button, and it has a value of text. This one has a value of email. So when you have a radio button and you use a value property, see there's a difference between value of text and then the word text. That is, this is what the user sees, and the value is what the JavaScript uses. Same thing here. Email is what the user sees. Email is the value property that the JavaScript uses. And in this demonstration, they use the checked property of a checkbox to say, if this is checked, then read that value. Otherwise, if this is checked, read that value. So using the check property, this is going to be Boolean, true or false. So you can put that inside of an if statement. If this checkbox is checked, do this. If this checkbox is checked, do this. You had a question, John?
I was going to say, this, I guess you do the same thing for like menu items as well. You have to assign a value to them. Or I guess you say, yes, so like when you're using the select to create a menu, like a drop down.
A drop down.
You had to, for each entry, you had to also assign a value to it for the JavaScript to read.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, and so that select is done with the select tag and options, and inside of those options you would have value attributes versus what the user would see. So you're correct there. Actually, here it is right here. All right, so here's our select tag, the option, the value is what the JavaScript uses, and then what goes in between is what the user sees. So can is what the JavaScript uses, Canada is what the user sees. Mex is what the JavaScript uses, Mexico is what the user sees. Here's how you would set a checked property to true or false. So I think that was a little bit of the curveball on yesterday's hands-on test. It was like, hey, when the user submits, uncheck all of the radio buttons. And so all the radio buttons were in an array, and so if you would have looped through the array and then set the checked property to false on all the radio buttons, you could have gotten rid of all the checks. You didn't have to use a loop, you could have just set all the checked properties to false. So you would target each one individually and set all the check to false. I didn't care how you did it, but those were just different options. Yes?
I was about to ask, do we have to go that way, or would we take a point for you just answer my question?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Again, if you target the form, you could submit it or reset it. Controls, focus versus blur is when the cursor goes onto a control versus goes off a control. And a select method is typically done on a select drop-down list. Also, select also selects the control, highlights it, highlights the text in there.
Excuse me, Mr. G.
Yep.
I know we already passed it, I know we already passed it, but he does it that smoothly, like it's actually.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I really can't make anything with it.
So these methods that are used with controls, I want you to think like a text box, and you're causing focus to go on the text box. So in the JavaScript, you select the text box and then you focus the text box. Right? So these are JavaScript methods that cause a behavior to happen on the screen. Right? You cause a select event to occur, but really focus and blur are the common ones. These are common control events. These are more user initiated, right? The user focuses the text box. The user blurs the text box, right? These are methods that you cause to occur with the JavaScript. These are events that the user initiates. Something that's unique with this change event, like you have a text box, and when you say change won't fire until you tab off of the text box. And so that's something that's, this change event, everything else pretty much works the way you would expect, but change doesn't happen until, yes, you do have to change what's in the text box, and then when you tab off. So it's not with every keystroke that its change is firing, it only fires when you tab off of the text box. And you actually saw this. You remember on change, if you did the lab where you had 5 text boxes and you had an event fire on change, that event didn't fire until you typed in like the average of 5 numbers. So you typed in a number and then you tabbed off of it. Right? So you've actually seen that. Again, submit and reset, these are on the form itself. This form stuff really isn't as much of what's new in this chapter as much as what is up here, which is all of the adding classes and removing classes and adding attributes and modifying attributes, all that stuff. This form stuff is really pretty much, I think you've been learning it on the fly. So what do we got here? We wired up a couple of event listeners. This event listener calls this method when the text is changed and tabbed off of. This years is this event listener runs on double click, and it calls this function. So these are named functions that are called when these events happen. And then this is a focus method that when the page loads, basically when the page loads, it puts focus on a certain control. Right? We can start doing things like validation now, right? So if the email is blank, show this text and make the text red. You know, we can start doing things here. So think about how this might happen. In your CSS, you might have, let's see if I can code this. Let's just do this. Let's do this. We're going to create a new form and a new script. We're going to have our form label first name. Label is first name. Input type of text. Okay. Let's button with the type of button. ID is submit. Let's have a span that is just a red star. So here's our red star. That basically means there's an error. If the form action, let's just send it to so if the submit event goes through, it's just going to redirect us to a different page called register.html. So here's our submit event. Let's make this a submit button. And make it a submit. Okay, so up here, our span, we're just going to turn all of our span color to red. I'll make a class of hidden. Display none. All right. So by default, span will have the class of hidden. So it's not there by default. So here I'm going to target the form, document get element by ID, the form user. So I'm going to target form user, add event listener for the submit event. I'm going to pass in an event object because that will allow me to prevent the default. And then I'm just going to do a console log submit. So I'm targeting the form. I'm using the submit event of the form. I'm preventing the default, which sends you to register. And I'm just logging it just to make sure that this is working. Okay, it does not submit me, so hopefully I have no bugs. And my console is not showing submit, so let's see what's going on here. DOM content loading, form user is my ID, add event listener, submit. My prevent default should be working because
Is the default to go to register.html?
yeah, and that stops it. This should stop me from navigating to register.html. Button
Your type of submit on the button is
Capital S,
I
haha.
don't know if that's matters.
Yeah, that'll make a difference.
No.
Now, I got this required, so that's probably stopping it.
There you go.
There we go.
Where was the
So what was stopping it was this required attribute, because this is an HTML5 that's used for validation. And because that required attribute was there, it was not submitting the form because it saw that it was blank. I don't want to use HTML5 to do validation. I'm just doing my own JavaScript validation. Right? So that was my problem. I had a required attribute that was doing HTML5 validation instead of JavaScript validation. Okay, so now I'm preventing the default behavior. So what we learned in this lecture Hey, Mr. Smith.
Hey.
This was before the forms. So we're going to do something like this. We're going to toggle the class of hidden on our span. So target the span, class list, toggle the class of hidden. So what's our span? Well, we can just literally target by so we'll do const span equals document query selector span. We'll do span dot class list dot toggle class of hidden. All right, so basically click the event listener. Now, maybe we don't need to toggle it because notice all we're going to do here is show and hide our, but that's not exactly correct. We want to see if that first name is blank, then we want to show the error message. And if it's not blank, we want to submit the form. Okay, so toggle isn't exactly what we need, right? We need to read the value of the text box first. So that's our first name. So let's read the value out of the first name text box, and it's the ID of first name. So first name. If first name triple equals 0. The first name is empty. Remove it. Otherwise, if it's not empty, add it and submit. That is pretty smart, isn't it? Actually, let's not submit it just so you can see. So if it's empty, remove the class of hidden. Otherwise, add the class of hidden. Let's inspect. Oh, I got them backwards. No, I should remove it. Okay, there it goes. Oh, there's my... I got a toggle in there still. See that? I was messing with me. Didn't mean to do that. right? Now, as soon as I put in something, it removes it. All I'm doing is adding and removing. And then if you do this, this will target our form and submit it, right? So assuming there were no errors, you could do something like this, constant if there's no errors, then submit the form. Because odds are you'll keep on checking for first name, last name, so on and so forth. Point being, if I put something in, it should submit the form. So error is false, form user submit. Put in our breakpoint, populate the data.
Oh, you just get rid of the parentheses, not a function. Or said it was in a function.
But it is. But it is. So here we stop the submission. If there's no errors, then we submit, and we're targeting the form. I don't think. I did not put all that in the video. I did pause all that in the video for your own sanity if you end up watching that video. What it boiled down to is that submit event on the form, at this instance, at this moment, it looks like that might not be there. So we had a very simple form that we selected and we're running submit, and it was saying it was unrecognized. So what we did was to submit our event, we just targeted the submit button on the form, the submit event of the form. We tested for an error, and if there was an error, we set this variable to true. There is an error. And then we said, if the error is true, prevent the default behavior, which is submitting the form. Otherwise, if this JavaScript runs and the error is never set to true, error is set to false, it will never stop and it will submit the form. So that's how we're going to handle our own custom validation here. So that's good. We got that on video for that. So that's all of this. I mean, we could essentially do this lab now, having these error messages pop up, writing our own custom JavaScript validation. Okay, let's take a break. Okay, so the last kind of important slide here introduces a few more methods of any node, right? So the node interface belongs to any node. We there's 4 kinds of nodes, so these are methods of these nodes. And these methods are append child, insert before, replace child, and remove. So these are actually how we add new elements to the DOM. So you think about append child, we're going to take something that wasn't there before and append it as a child. All right, so maybe you target a div and you add a new paragraph of text to the page. Right, because so far we've been doing inner HTML, right? But we're not really adding new elements, right? So append child is a method that allows us to add something new to our markup. We haven't done that before. And so let's just have an idea of container, okay, with nothing in it. And I'm just going to write a little bit of script. Okay, so here's our DOM content loaded. And we're just going to do this once the DOM content loads. We'll just do this directly in here instead of waiting for an event. So we need to learn how to append a child. So we're going to target the div called container, and we're going to append a child. And that child, we're going to use create element. So we're going to use JavaScript to create a new paragraph. And then that paragraph, we'll just call it P. And then we're going to append the paragraph to the div. Right? So create element and append child. Right? Create a new element in JavaScript and append child using JavaScript. So let P equals document create element P. Document get element by ID. Container. Append child P. Keep in mind our paragraph doesn't have anything in it yet. But here you can see no paragraph in here. If I didn't have a mistake, it should go ahead and put in a paragraph into my markup. Again, we're not going to be able to see that unless we inspect. And there's our paragraph. Okay. So, wasn't there before? Again, all sorts of content can be created using JavaScript, on events. So, classic example that I'm going to give 1,000 times in this class, you hover something, there was no content there before, a little paragraph box pops up with a description of that something, right? We need some text. We need our paragraph needs some text. And so maybe we do P inner HTML, hello world. There you go.
I thought you would put something like that underneath the append child.
Well, we're modifying the element, the paragraph element, and then we just add the paragraph element to the container. Let's see what happens if we add another one. create element, append child, right? Probably you're just going to assume adding it to the bottom. So that's your append child. Insert before. You saw that append child tacks it to the bottom. You might guess what an insert before does, right? So let's put in, just put in an H3. This is just all about where it puts it on the DOM. That's all this is. So insert before. Let's look up insert before. So here's our parent, here's our child. Reading the parent div. So new node is what we're inserting. New node is the span. And SP2 is the child that we're putting it in before. So new node is what we're inserting. And then the second argument is what we're inserting it before. And in this case, so let's do this. Let's use this markup. Here's our paragraph called P. Simplify this, right? I think we can simplify this. So we need to target the parent div. So the parent, insert it before this child element. So we're inserting it before the child element, which is the child. We need to target the child, which is the span. So we target the parent. We target the child. We say parent insert before the new element, which is P, and we insert it before the child.
So what does putting the P there do?
Well, keep in mind, the first method that we learned, append child, put it at the bottom, basically. This is gonna, of the, it made it almost like the last element in the container. This is gonna put it as the first element in the container. So you can see here, this puts it above instead of at the bottom. If I were to just do append child, so here's insert before, but here's parent dot append child P. You can see it's going to put it at the bottom of the container, underneath foobar.
But in the insert before, is there a reason that the P has to be there?
The P is what we're inserting,
Yeah.
and the second argument here is what we're inserting it before. What specific element is it going before? So if there were, maybe here's another one. Call this child 2, child 1. Yeah? So now this will be child 2 let's insert the paragraph before child 2. See how that works? Whereas again, if you're just appending it, it's going to put it at the bottom. Replace child. So we're going to take our paragraph and replace child 2. Parent dot replace child. We're inserting our paragraph where child 2 used to be, which was a span. Right? Removes one, puts in another. Simple demonstrations, but very powerful tools. Remove child, well, suffice to say, that's easy to see what that does. Remove, let's just do parent.remove. Removes the whole parent. What about child 2 remove? Just removes the whole element. Just whatever you select, child 1 remove. Wait a minute. Child 1 remove. So remove's pretty powerful. So there's a lot that can be done potentially, right? Creating new markup with create element. You can create a whole, create a whole header, create a whole footer, create a whole whatever, product, widget, sidebar. All right, I think we're kind of at the end of the slideshow. They do a couple examples of creating elements and inserting before, so on and so forth. That's the end of the PowerPoint.